On the night of April 4th, 1958, the most beautiful blonde leading lady in Hollywood stood in the upstairs hallway of her Beverly Hills mansion and watched her 14-year-old daughter drive a butcher knife into the abdomen of her boyfriend. The boyfriend was Johnny Stompanato. He was 32 years old. He was a former enforcer for the Los Angeles mobster Mickey Cohen. He had been, for approximately 10 months, the man whose violent presence had organized the daily reality of the household, and who had, on the evening in question, been screaming at the mother that he intended to cut her face so badly that no studio would ever cast her again. The daughter heard the screaming. She came up the stairs holding the knife she had taken from the kitchen. She entered the bedroom. She intervened in exactly the way a 14-year-old who had been listening to her mother be threatened for months would intervene. He was dead within minutes. The mother was Lana Turner. At the time of the killing, an Academy Award nominee for Peyton Place, photographed more than any other American actress of her generation, and the subject of one of the most heavily promoted MGM Star Machinery campaigns of the entire studio era. The daughter was Cheryl Crane. She would be tried for murder within the month. The verdict, when it came, would be the verdict that the Los Angeles coroner's office had not anticipated. The decade that followed would deliver her into psychiatric hospitalization, reform school, 2 escapes, and a public adulthood that the country watched with the appalled fascination it reserved for the children of its most famous stars. Tonight, we tell you the story of Cheryl Crane, the only child of one of the most spectacularly mistreated women of Hollywood's golden age, raised inside a profession of 8 stepfathers, and asked at 14 to defend her mother with the kind of physical decisiveness no 14-year-old should ever be asked to demonstrate. You think you know Lana Turner. You don't know what her only daughter paid for being hers. But first, who was Lana before the studio decided what she would be? Julia Jean Mildred Frances Turner was born on February 8, 1921, in the small mining town of Wallace, Idaho. Population approximately 3,000, located in the silver mining country of the Idaho Panhandle near the Montana border. Her father, John Virgil Turner, was a coal miner and a part-time bootlegger. Her mother, Mildred Frances Cowan, had married him at the age of 16. The household, by every account that survives, was the kind of small, unstable, working-class household that the rural American West routinely produced in the years following the First World War. Financially marginal, geographically transient, organized around the father's drinking and the mother's slow accumulation of survival skills. The family moved to San Francisco when Julia, called Judy by everyone in the household, was 6. The move was not, in any obvious sense, an improvement. Johns Turner was, by 1930, working seasonally on the docks and conducting on the side the small gambling and bootlegging operations that the Prohibition years had made structurally available to men of his class. On December 14, 1930, John Turner left a craps game in San Francisco, having just won approximately $3,000. He was followed home from the game. He was robbed. He was beaten to death by his attackers and left on a downtown street corner with his pockets emptied. The body was discovered by a passing pedestrian. The crime was never solved. The killer was never identified. The case file was closed by the San Francisco Police Department within a year and was, by the standards of working-class investigations of the early 1930s, given approximately the institutional attention such cases routinely received. Which is to say, almost notes none. Judy Turner was 9 years old. She had absorbed, by the age of 9, the violent street corner murder of the only father she had ever known. The household, after John's death, collapsed into the kind of patchwork survival that Depression-era widowhood required of working-class American mothers. Mildred Turner took work as a beautician. She moved her daughter to Los Angeles in 1936. The geographic shift the period was conducting on behalf of every working-class single mother who had decided that a 16-year-old daughter with an extraordinary face might be the family's path out of poverty. The face was not the calculated investment Mildred made it. The face was simply what Judy Turner had been born with. But the move to Los Angeles, by every documented account, was the deliberate decision of a working-class mother who had recognized, without sentiment, without illusion, what her daughter's face might be worth in the right market. The discovery, when it came, was one of the most mythologized incidents in the entire history of American studio publicity. In January 1937, Judy Turner, 15 years old, enrolled at Hollywood High School, working part-time as a switchboard operator for $16 a week, walked across the street during a typing class to purchase a Coca-Cola at a small soda fountain called the Top Hat Cafe, located on the corner of Sunset Boulevard and Manhattan Place. Sitting at the soda fountain that afternoon was Billy Wilkerson, the editor and publisher of The Hollywood Reporter. He was the most influential trade press figure in the American film industry of the 1930s. He saw the teenager order her Coca-Cola. He approached her. He asked if she had ever considered being in films. The story would be repeated across the next 60 years of American studio publicity in approximately 1,000 variations. The soda fountain, the Coca-Cola, the famous tight sweater that did not, in fact, exist in the actual original encounter, but would be retroactively added to the legend by the MGM publicity office across the late 1940s. The myth would become, by the early 1950s, one of the central foundational stories that the American studio industry told about itself. Wilkerson referred the teenager to the agent Zeppo Marx, one of the four Marx brothers, who had retired from performing to operate a talent agency. Marx took her on. He brought her to Mervyn LeRoy, then a director at Warner Brothers. Leroy signed her in February 1937, 6 weeks after the soda fountain encounter. He renamed her Lana Turner. She would be Lana for the rest of her professional life. The name Judy, the small Idaho mining town childhood, the murdered father, the working-class single-mother household that had brought her to Los Angeles, would be retroactively rewritten by the studio publicity machinery into the carefully constructed Hollywood discovery narrative that the country would rescue across the next 2 decades. She appeared in her first film, They Won't Forget, in 1937. She was 16 years old. The film featured a brief but heavily emphasized walking scene in a fitted sweater that the studio publicity machinery would later use to construct the sweeter girl persona that organized her early career. When Mervyn LeRoy left Warner Brothers in 1938, for MGM he brought Lana Turner with him. She was now contracted to the most powerful studio in Hollywood. She was 17 years old. She had not, by any meaningful measurement of preparation, been adequately readied for what the next 20 years of her professional life would do to her. The studio absorbed her. The studio rebuilt her. The studio also began almost immediately the procession of professional and personal arrangements that would define the central decades of her adult biography. By 1943, at the age of 22, Lana was one of the top-billed leading ladies at MGM. She had appeared opposite Clark Gable, Spencer Tracy, Robert Taylor, and James Stewart. She had been photographed for Life magazine. She had been featured in newsreel coverage at military bond rallies during the early years of the Second World War. She had also, by 1943, been married twice. Her first marriage, to the bandleader Artie Shaw, conducted as an elopement to Las Vegas in February 1940, had lasted 4 months. She was 19 at the wedding. She was 19 at the divorce. Her second marriage, to the restaurant owner Joseph Stephen Crane, conducted in July 1942, was annulled and then reconducted within months due to the discovery that Crane's prior divorce had not been legally finalized at the time of their first wedding. On the second attempt at the Crane marriage, Lana became pregnant. The pregnancy survived. On July 25, 1943, in a Los Angeles hospital, Lana Turner gave birth to her only child. The baby was a girl. She weighed 7 pounds 4 ounces. The delivery was difficult. Cheryl was born blue from oxygen deprivation and required emergency resuscitation in the first minutes of her life. The medical staff stabilized her. The mother recovered. They named the baby Cheryl Christina Crane. She would, by the second year of her life, have already absorbed the structural reality that the working life of an MGM contract player did not permit consistent maternal presence. The pattern, by Cheryl's second birthday, was set. Lana Turner's second marriage, the marriage that had produced Cheryl, collapsed before the daughter was 2 years old. The divorce from Stephen Crane was finalized in 1944. Lana retained primary custody. Crane retained visitation. The third marriage came in 1948. Bob Topping, the heir to a tin plate fortune, a man whose primary professional activity was being wealthy, lasted 4 years. The divorce was finalized in 1952. The fourth marriage came in 1953. Lex Barker, the actor who had played Tarzan in 5 films across the late 1940s, lasted 4 years. The divorce was finalized in 1957. Across these 4 marriages and the various adjacent relationships, Cheryl Crane was raised primarily by household staff, by her maternal grandmother Mildred, and, during the more difficult periods, at boarding school. She was photographed at premieres. She was photographed at birthday parties. She was photographed with the casual entitlement of the period, as if she were a small accessory to her mother's working life rather than a separate human being. She was, by 1957, 14 years old. She had revealed, by that year, to her mother and to a psychiatrist she had been seeing privately, that her stepfather, Lex Barker, had been sexually abusing her since she was approximately 10 years old. Lana Turner, on hearing the disclosure daughter, drove home to the family residence, retrieved a loaded pistol from her bedroom, held it to her sleeping husband Lex Barker's head, woke him, and told him to leave the property within the hour. He left. The divorce was filed within weeks. Cheryl was 14 years old. She had been sexually abused for 4 years by a man her mother had married. She had now witnessed her mother conduct a pistol-point eviction of her abuser. She had received, in this small fragment of structural justice, the closest thing to maternal protection her childhood had ever provided. 6 months later, Johnny Stompanato entered the household. Johnny Stompanato entered Lana Turner's life in the spring of 1957. He was 31 years old at the time of the introduction. He was, by every documented account of his biography that survives, a former United States Marine who had served in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War and had, upon returning to civilian life, drifted by a combination of personal charisma and a complete absence of legitimate professional ambition into the orbit of the Los Angeles organized crime figure Mickey Cohen. He had worked as a bodyguard for Cohen. He had worked as a courier for various of Cohen's operations. He had been arrested several times across the late 1940s and early 1950s on charges ranging from vagrancy to extortion, none of which had resulted in significant prison time. He had developed, across the early 1950s, a small but consistent sideline of seducing wealthy and famous women in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills, conducting brief relationships with them, and extracting from those relationships the financial accommodations his lack of legitimate income required. He was, in the precise structural sense, a professional predator who specialized in women of public visibility. He used, with most of these women, an alias. He introduced himself initially as John Steele. The name was the standard one he had been working under for the previous several years. The women he seduced typically discovered the real name, Stompanato, only after the relationship had progressed past the point at which the discovery could be conducted without complication. Lana Turner met him in April 1957. She had recently completed the divorce from Lex Barker. She was 36 years old. She was, by every account of her own subsequent testimony, in the kind of emotionally depleted post-divorce state that the men who specialized in her demographic understood as their primary opportunity. The relationship that followed lasted approximately 10 months. It would define, in the most precise sense, the central public catastrophe of her life. The violence began within weeks of the relationship's start. Stompanato was, by every account that survives from the household staff, from Cheryl Crane's later testimony, and from the police reports that would eventually be filed after his death, a serially physically abusive man. He hit Lana. He hit her with the routine frequency of a man who had been hitting women for years, and who had not, until that point in his biography, encountered consequences sufficient to discourage the behavior. The bruises were photographed, retroactively, in the police evidence files compiled after April 1958. They were extensive. They had been concealed by makeup, by long sleeve, by the routine professional disciplines that working actresses of her generation had developed for managing physical evidence of domestic violence. Cheryl saw the bruises. Cheryl heard the screaming. Cheryl, by her own later published account in her 1988 memoir Detour, a Hollywood story, lived inside a household across the final 10 months of 1957, and the early months of 1958, in which the violence directed at her mother had become the daily organizing reality of every room she entered. She was 14 years old. She had, in the prior year, completed the disclosure to her mother about Lex Barker. She had now absorbed, within months of one stepfather's removal, the arrival of a new and more violent man who had moved into the family residence and who had begun, with the casual fluency of a professional abuser, to threaten the mother in the daughter's presence. Stompanato's threats, by the testimony Cheryl would later provide, escalated across the early months of 1958. He told Lana, in screamed confrontations the household staff overheard, that he would disfigure her face if she attempted to leave him. He told her he would cut her so badly that no studio in Hollywood would ever cast her in a leading role again. He told her, by the testimony that would later emerge at the coroner's inquest, that he would not only injure her but would, if she resisted, kill her mother and her daughter as well. Lana was, by every measurement of her professional career, at one of the most consequential moments of her working life. She had filmed Peyton Place in 1957. The film had been released in December of that year. The reviews had been the strongest of her career. The Academy Award nominations were being announced across February 1958. She was nominated on February 17, 1958, for the Academy Award for Best Actress. The ceremony was scheduled for March 26, 1958. Stompanato attended with her, uninvited by every account that survives but unavoidable. The photographs from the evening captured the smiling, forced public composure of a leading lady at the absolute peak of her professional visibility, accompanied by a man the entire industry had quietly begun to understand was destroying her in private. She did not win. The award went to Joanne Woodward for The Three Faces of Eve. Lana returned home to the rented Bel Air residence at 730 North Bedford Drive. She was sharing her daughter, her mother Mildred, and the man who had threatened to disfigure her. 8 days later, he was dead. The events of the evening of April 4, 1958, have been reconstructed across the decades that followed in approximately 1,000 contradictory and partially overlapping accounts. What is documented by the police evidence and the coroner's inquest testimony is the following sequence. Lana Turner and Johnny Stompanato were in her upstairs bedroom on the second floor of the Bel Air residence. Cheryl Crane was in her own bedroom across the hallway. The household staff were elsewhere in the residence. Lana's mother Mildred was downstairs. An argument began in the upstairs bedroom shortly after dinner. The argument escalated. Stompanato, by Lana's later testimony at the inquest, threatened to cut her face. He picked up a hanger from the bedroom closet, which Cheryl, listening from her own bedroom across the hall, interpreted as a possible weapon. Cheryl left her bedroom. She walked downstairs to the kitchen. She retrieved an 8-inch carving knife from the kitchen counter. She walked back upstairs. She stood outside her mother's bedroom door, holding the knife. Lana opened the door. The argument had reached the point at which she was attempting to physically separate herself from Stompanato. Cheryl, standing in the hallway with the knife, asked her mother whether everything was all right. Lana attempted to reassure her. Stompanato, behind Lana, continued screaming. The next sequence of events occurred within approximately 3 seconds. Stompanato moved forward. Behind Lana, in a manner Cheryl interpreted as the beginning of an attack on her mother, Cheryl stepped forward through the doorway. She drove the carving knife, held into downward stabbing grip, into the left side of Stompanato's abdomen, penetrating to a depth of approximately 4 inches. The blade entered the abdomen, perforated the kidney, and severed the renal artery. The wound was, in any meaningful surgical sense, immediately fatal. Stompanato collapsed onto the bedroom carpet. He was unconscious for approximately 90 seconds. He died of catastrophic internal hemorrhage before paramedics arrived. Lana, in the minutes that followed, did 3 things in approximately the following order. She called her mother Mildred, who was downstairs. She called her personal physician, who arrived at the residence within 15 minutes. She called her attorney Jerry Giesler, the most famous criminal defense lawyer in Los Angeles, who had represented Errol Flynn in his 1943 statutory rape trial and Charlie Chaplin in his 1944 paternity case. She did not, in those first minutes, call the police. Giesler arrived. He examined the scene. He instructed Lana on what to say. He then, with the time-stamped record of a call placed approximately 40 minutes after the killing, contacted the Beverly Hills Police Department. The 40-minute delay between the death and the police notification became, in the days and weeks that followed, one of the central forensic and journalistic controversies of the case. Critics of the official version, including, eventually, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, would suggest that the scene had been managed during those 40 minutes in ways that the subsequent forensic investigation had not been able to entirely reconstruct. Cheryl, during those 40 minutes, was waiting in a separate room with her grandmother Mildred. She was 14 years old. She had just killed a man who had been threatening her mother for 10 months. She did not, by her own later testimony, fully understand the legal consequences of what she had done. She did, by every account that survives, understand the immediate consequences. The man was dead. She had killed him. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Inquest convened on April 11, 1958, exactly 1 week after the killing. The inquest was conducted by the standard procedures of the period. 6 citizen jurors empaneled to determine the cause of death and the legal characterization of the killing. The proceeding was open to the press. It was attended by approximately 120 journalists. It was broadcast in extended portions on live television. Lana Turner testified for approximately 62 minutes. Her testimony was, by every retrospective evaluation of the legal and journalistic record, one of the most consequential single performances of her career. She wept. She described the violence. She described the threats. With the careful repetition of someone who had been prepared for the testimony by Jerry Giesler, the precise sequence of events that supported the legal theory of justifiable homicide in defense of another. The jury deliberated for approximately 20 minutes. The verdict, when it came, was justifiable homicide. Cheryl Crane was not indicted. She was not tried. She was not charged. The case was, by the formal legal determination of the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, closed within 10 days of the killing. The case was, by the substantially less formal determination of the American press and public, not closed. The questions about the 40-minute delay, about the precise sequence of events in the bedroom, about whether Lana herself had actually been the one who delivered the fatal stab wound, and had then arranged the testimony to protect her career, would continue to circulate across the next 60 years. In the months following the verdict, Cheryl Crane was not, in any meaningful sense, returned to ordinary childhood. The press surrounded the residence. The hate mail arrived in the thousands. Mickey Cohen released, to the Los Angeles tabloids, private letters Lana had written to Stompanato that the public read as evidence of her complicity in the relationship's central pathology. The juvenile court, by August 1958, made a decision. In August 1958, the Los Angeles County Juvenile Court, operating under its standard authority to evaluate the welfare of minors who had been involved in violent incidents, conducted a review of Cheryl Crane's domestic situation. The court considered the documented record of the previous 15 months. The Lex Barker abuse disclosure in 1957. The 10 months of Johnny Stompanato's violent presence in the household. The killing of April 4th. The 2 months of subsequent press coverage that had made the family residence inaccessible to ordinary daily functioning. The substantial publicly circulating documentation that Cheryl's mother had not, by any reasonable standard of parental responsibility, been providing a protective household environment. The court issued, in late August 1958, an order removing Cheryl from her mother's custody. She was placed by court directive in the care of her maternal grandmother Mildred Turner. The order was, in the legal arithmetic of the period, the closest the California juvenile court sisters was prepared to come to a public statement that Lana Turner had failed her daughter at a structural level. The court did not find Lana criminally negligent. The court did not find Lana legally responsible for the killing. The court did, however, decline to return the 14-year-old daughter to the residence in which the killing had occurred, and in which the documented record of the previous several years suggested no 14-year-old should reasonably be expected to live. Cheryl moved into her grandmother's residence. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. It was not, in any meaningful sense, temporary. She did not return to her mother's primary custody for the remainder of her adolescence. The next 4 years of Cheryl Crane's life, between the ages of 14 and 18, would be conducted across a sequence of psychiatric hospitalizations, reform schools, juvenile court interventions, and the ongoing public visibility that the killing had imposed on her permanent identity. She would be admitted, in 1960, to the El Retiro School for Girls, a Los Angeles County reform school that the juvenile court had assigned her to after a series of episodes the court had characterized as indicative of unmanageable behavior. She would escape from El Retiro. She would be recaptured. She would escape again. She would be admitted in 1961 to the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut, one of the most prominent psychiatric facilities in the United States, where the family had been able to secure private placement. She remained at the Institute of Living for approximately 20 months. The treatment she received during this period included, by her own later memoir account, the standard psychiatric interventions of the period. Extensive individual psychotherapy, group therapy, the kinds of pharmaceutical interventions that the early 1960s had begun to make available to adolescent patients. She did not receive electroconvulsive therapy. She was not subjected to the more invasive interventions that had organized the experience of some of her contemporaries in similar facilities. She emerged from the Institute of Living in 1963, at the age of 19. She had completed, during her residency, the equivalent of her secondary education. She had not, by the available evidence of her own later account, been substantially healed by the treatment. She had been, in the more limited sense that the period understood, stabilized. She moved back to Los Angeles. She attempted, with the modest financial support her mother was prepared to provide, to construct an adult life from the materials her adolescence had left her. The materials were not promising. She was 19 years old. She had killed a man at 14. She had been the subject of approximately 5 years of continuous national press coverage. She had not, in any meaningful sense, completed the normal developmental tasks of adolescence that her peers had been completing. She would spend the next decade, between her release from the Institute of Living and her early 30s, constructing, slowly and against considerable structural resistance, the adult identity her childhood had not permitted. Lana Turner, during these same years, continued working. The killing did not end her career. The killing did not, by the most precise measurement of her professional trajectory, even substantially damage her career in the immediate years following the event. Her next film after Stompanato's death, Imitation of Life, directed by Douglas Sirk and released in April 1959, became one of the highest-grossing films of her entire working life. The film's central theme, of a single mother's failure to adequately protect her daughter from the consequences of her own ambition, was received by the audiences of 1959 as a kind of fictional confession that the actual living woman at the center of the recent scandal had not been able to make publicly. The audiences came. The grosses were substantial. Imitation of Life would generate, in its initial theatrical release, more income than any of Lana Turner's previous films. It would be re-released across the 1960s. It would eventually become, through television syndication, home video, and the long retrospective curatorial attention of film scholars, one of the central works of the entire melodrama tradition of the mid-20th century. She continued working across the 1960s and into the 1970s. She appeared in Portrait in Black in 1960. She appeared in By Love Possessed in 1961. She appeared in Madame X in 1966. She appeared in The Big Cube in 1969. She continued, into the early 1980s, working in television roles, guest appearances on series, made-for-television films, the kind of late-career working life that fading studio-era leading ladies had begun to construct as the original theatrical film distribution system collapsed across the 1970s. She married after Stompanato 3 more times: Fred May in 1960, Robert Eaton in 1965, Ronald Peller in 1969. Each of the marriages ended in divorce within approximately 5 years. She had, by the end of her marital cycle, been married 8 times to 7 different men. She had, across the full sequence, never lived in any marriage long enough to produce the kind of sustained domestic continuity that an ordinary household typically constructs across years of accumulated daily routine. She had also, by approximately 1970, lost most meaningful contact with her daughter. Cheryl had not returned to the household. Cheryl had not, after the Institute of Living, agreed to the kind of sustained reconciliation that Lana's middle-aged efforts to repair the relationship would, intermittently, attempt to achieve. The structural damage of the killing, and of the years preceding it, had not been repairable through the available emotional resources of the family. Cheryl Crane built, across her 20s and 30s, the adult life that her adolescence had not predicted. She worked, in her early 20s, as a hostess and manager at a series of restaurants in Los Angeles. She moved, in the to late 1960s, into the real estate sector, eventually becoming, across the 1970s and 1980s, a successful Beverly Hills residential real estate agent specializing in the high-end properties of the canyons and the flat blocks south of Sunset Boulevard. She was good at the work. She had been raised by structural exposure inside the social geography of the West Side. She knew the houses. She knew the families. She understood, by the inheritance of her own childhood, the particular requirements that wealthy Los Angeles residential clients had developed for the agents who handled their property transactions. She conducted, in her adult life, the personal arrangements that her own choices had organized for her. She did not marry. She did not have children. She built, by her early 30s, a long-term partnership with a woman named Joyce Leroy, a real estate professional whose adult life had been organized along similar lines and whose presence in Cheryl's life would, by the available record of the next 40-plus years, become the central organizing intimacy of Cheryl's adult biography. She came out publicly as a lesbian in her 1988 memoir, Detour, a Hollywood story. The disclosure was, by the standards of celebrity memoir of the late 1980s, both unusual and substantially courageous. The Los Angeles social environment in which Cheryl operated professionally was not, in 1988, uniformly hospitable to the public disclosure of lesbians' identity by working real estate professionals who depended on the social acceptance of conservative clients. She made the disclosure anyway. She experienced, by every account that survives, substantially less professional damage than the disclosure might have produced for a less established figure. The memoir itself became, in 1988, a substantial commercial success. It debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. It remained on the list for 14 weeks. It generated, in its initial publication and subsequent paperback distribution, the kind of revenue that gave Cheryl, for the first time in her adult life, significant financial independence from the residual structures of her family's accumulated assets. The memoir was, in its central narrative, the document her adolescence had not been allowed to produce. She described the abuse by Lex Barker. She described the violence of the Stompanato household. She described the killing, in her own words, in her own voice, for the first time since the inquest testimony of April 1958. The reconciliation between Cheryl and her mother across the second half of Lana Turner's life was slow, partial, and never entirely completed. The two women had not maintained sustained intimate contact across Cheryl's adolescence. The relationship that began to be rebuilt across Cheryl's 20s and 30s was a careful, structurally limited adult relationship between two women who had decided that the residual functional connection was worth maintaining even if the deeper repair was not available to them. Lana attended, by occasional account, the milestones of Cheryl's adult life, the professional achievements, the book publication, the opening of Cheryl's restaurants, the various accomplishments that Cheryl, across her adult decades, was constructing for herself. Lana did not, in any sustained way, become the daily intimate maternal presence in her daughter's adult life that the previous decades had failed to construct. Lana also, across the late 1970s and the 1980s, began the process of writing her own memoir, published in 1982 as Lana, The Lady, the Legend, the Truth. The book was, in its central treatment of the Stompanato killing, the standard mother's perspective version of the events that the inquest testimony had already publicly established. Lana did not, in the memoir, contradict the official record. She did not, in the memoir, take public responsibility for the household failures that had produced the conditions in which the killing had occurred. She did, by the narrative posture of the entire book, present herself as a survivor of the events rather than as the central adult whose decisions had produced the conditions her daughter had been required to act inside. Cheryl's 1988 memoir, by contrast, did take that responsibility for her mother and by extension for the household. The two memoirs, read together, constitute one of the more documentary mother-daughter pairings in 20th century American autobiography. They occupy, in their structural disagreement about who was responsible for what, exactly the discrepancy that the daughter's adolescence had been unable to articulate at the time. The two women, despite the structural reasons that both memoirs documented, remained in contact across Lana's final decade. Lana was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1992. The cancer was, by all medical accounts, attributable to the lifetime of heavy smoking that had been an unremarkable feature of her professional and personal life since adolescence. She fought the cancer with the standard treatments of the early 1990s. The treatments held the disease in check for approximately 3 years. She died on June 29, 1995, at her apartment in Century City, California. She was 74 years old. Cheryl was at her bedside. In the days following Lana Turner's death, the legal documents that had organized the distribution of her estate were unsealed. The estate, by the time of her death, was modest. The accumulated expenses of 7 divorces, the staff requirements of late career working life, the medical costs of the final illness, and the broader spending patterns that had organized Lana's adult life had reduced what had once been a substantial earning record to a comparatively small remaining residual. The will, however, contained a final clause that the family had not anticipated. The clause was directed entirely at Cheryl. The will Lana Turner had executed in the final years of her life contained, in its central operative section, a single clause that the family had not anticipated. She had left the bulk of her remaining estate, the apartment in Century City, the residual income rights from her film catalogue, the accumulated personal property of her working life, not directly to her only child Cheryl, but to a trust whose primary beneficiary was Carmen Lopez Cruz, the housekeeper who had cared for Lana across the final 20 years of her life. Carmen had been with Lana since the mid-1970s. She had managed the household. She had nursed Lana through the cancer treatments of the early 1990s. She had been, by every account that survives from the small circle of people who had been present in Lana's final years, the closest thing to sustained daily intimate companionship that Lana had constructed in the second half of her life. The will provided Carmen with the primary residential and income inheritance. The will provided Cheryl with a substantially smaller residual bequest. By some published estimates, approximately $50,000, and an accession of personal mementos. The will provided Lana's only grandson, Joshua. Cheryl's mother's only direct biological grandchild was not produced. Joshua, referenced in some accounts, was actually Lana's grandnephew through her sister-in-law's family. With various small specific items, the arrangement was, by the standards of celebrity inheritance distributions, unusual. Most working actresses of Lana's generation, even those whose relationships with their adult children had been structurally complicated, had directed the primary inheritance to the biological line. Lana had not. She had directed it, with the deliberate precision of a final document executed after sustained legal consultation, to the woman who had actually been present during her final decades. The clause was, in the most precise emotional sense, the document Lana had been unable to write across the previous 52 years. She had been unable to write the apology to her daughter. She had been able, in the inheritance instrument, to communicate the structural acknowledgement that her primary intimate relationship of the final 2 decades of her life had not been with the daughter she had failed to protect, but with the working-class housekeeper who had stayed. Cheryl, by every account of her public response in the months that followed, did not contest the will. The 3 decades following Lana Turner's death were, for Cheryl Crane, the longest sustained period of her adult life. She continued her real estate work in Beverly Hills across the late 1990s and early 2000s. She continued her partnership with Joyce Leroy. She continued the small, consistent disciplines of adult professional life. The daily routines of property showings, the quiet evenings at home, the seasonal travel that established working professionals of her income bracket typically conducted. She did not, in any sustained way, return to public visibility in the years following her mother's death. The 1988 memoir had been her primary public statement. The years that followed were the years during which she was permitted, by the slow attrition of celebrity press attention spans, to recede into the kind of ordinary adult professional existence that her adolescence had not predicted. She wrote a second book, a novel, The Bad Always Die Twice, published in 2011 when she was 68 years old. The novel was a fictional Hollywood mystery. It did not attempt to relitigate the events of her own life. It was reviewed politely by the small remaining segment of the American press that had continued, across the decades, to track the post-celebrity literary careers of figures from the studio era. Joyce Leroy died in 2010, after the partnership had lasted approximately 45 years. Cheryl was 67 years old. She had, by the long arithmetic of adult intimacy that the structural failures of her childhood had originally seemed to make impossible, built and sustained a relationship of greater duration and stability than any of her mother's 8 marriages combined. She did not partner again after Joyce's death. She continued, into her 70s and her early 80s, the modest, disciplined adult life she had constructed across the previous 5 decades. She also continued, by the available record of her occasional public appearances, the slow accumulation of structural recovery from the events of her adolescence. She attended, in the 2000s and 2010s, occasional film historical events at which her mother's work was being commemorated. She participated with the careful precision of a public figure who had decided which portions of her own biography she was prepared to discuss. In occasional documentary projects about studio-era Hollywood, she did not, in any of these appearances, present herself as a victim of her mother. She presented herself as a survivor of a specific structural situation that had been organized, across her childhood, by adults who had not been equipped to organize it adequately. She was, by the testimony of her own measured adult speech across the decades, considerably more generous in her public assessment of her mother than her mother had been, in the 1982 memoir, in her public assessment of the household. This was, in the long arithmetic of mother-daughter biographies in the studio-era cohort, unusual. Most daughters of the era did not extend this generosity. Cheryl did. The generosity was, in its own measured way, the achievement. The complete record of the men who passed through Lana Turner's household across the years of Cheryl's childhood and adolescence deserves a final, precise enumeration. Stephen Crane, Cheryl's biological father, was present in the household only for the first year of his daughter's life. He remarried, moved into the restaurant business, and conducted across the subsequent decades a generally cordial but structurally limited relationship with his daughter. He died in 1985. He was not the figure for what consequent adult presence in Cheryl's childhood. Bob Topping. Lana's third husband, married 1948 to 1952, was a wealthy heir whose presence in the household was, by the available record, neither particularly damaging nor particularly nurturing. He drifted in and out of the residence. He drifted out permanently in 1952. Lex Barker, Lana's fourth husband, married 1953 to 1957, was the predator whose sexual abuse of the stepdaughter would, in 1957, be disclosed. He was the most consequential negative presence in Cheryl's childhood. He died in 1973 in New York City of a heart attack on a Manhattan sidewalk at the age of 53. Johnny Stompanato, never legally married to Lana, but resident in the household across the final 10 months of his life, was the figure whose presence in the upstairs bedroom on April 4, 1958, organized the entire subsequent reorganization of Cheryl's identity. Fred May, Robert Eaton, Ronald Peller, Lana's husbands 5, 6 and 7, were the post-Cheryl marriages conducted after Cheryl had been removed from the household. None of them produced sustained intimate contact with the daughter. The complete count, including Stephen Crane and the various non-marital adjacent figures, comes to approximately 8 adult men who occupied, across the 18 years of Cheryl's childhood and adolescence, the structural position of household male presence. Of the 8, by Cheryl's own published assessment, exactly 1 had been sexually abusive in the documented sense. Exactly 1 had been physically violent toward her mother in the documented sense. The remaining 6 had been varying combinations of distant, transient, or structurally inadequate. The aggregate effect, on the daughter who had been raised inside this rotating procession was the developmental damage that the killing of April 1958 had ultimately expressed. Lana Turner had been one of the most photographed American women of the 20th century. She had appeared, by the conservative measurement of the studio publicity records that survive, in more than 5,000 published photographs across her working career. She had been featured on the covers of Life, Look, Photoplay, Modern Screen, Movie Mirror, and approximately 300 other periodicals across 4 decades. She had been one of the central marketing instruments of the entire MGM publicity apparatus across the 1940s and the early 1950s. The photographic record, taken as a whole, demonstrates the structural problem. Almost none of the photographs depict her daughter. The household that produced her daughter's adolescence was not, in any meaningful sense, documented. The same cameras that documented the working actress at the center of it. Cheryl was occasionally included in the carefully managed publicity images. She was not, in any sustained way, the subject of the same contingent documentary attention that her mother was. The asymmetry was the structural pattern. The famous mother was photographed continuously. The daughter inside the same household was photographed sporadically, ceremonially, in the precise pattern of celebrity child photography that the period had developed for the children of working stars. The daughter was not, by any meaningful measurement of the photographic record, a primary subject. She was, in the precise editorial decision-making of the period's publicity offices, an accessory to the primary subject. This was, in retrospect, the most accurate visual documentation of the household. The cameras had recorded what the household actually was. The mother had been the center. The daughter had been the structural appendage to the center. The killing of April 4th, 1958, had been the moment at which the appendage, against every structural prediction of its prior positioning, had moved. The appendage had picked up the knife. The appendage had defended the center. The center had survived. The appendage had paid for the defense across the subsequent 6 decades. The story of Cheryl Crane is not, in the long historical pattern of studio-era Hollywood, an isolated case. The cohort of leading ladies whose careers were organized by the major studios across the 1930s, 1940s, and early 1950s, Joan Crawford, Bette Davis, Lana Turner, Rita Hayworth, Judy Garland, and several others, produced a generation of daughters whose adolescences shared structural features that the popular literature of the period had no vocabulary for. The daughters were raised inside households organized around the working schedules of leading actresses whose contracts had typically been negotiated to maximize the studio's production efficiency rather than the capacity for sustained parental presence. The daughters were photographed at premieres. They were photographed at birthday parties. They were raised, in the daily structural sense, by household staff, by maternal grandmothers, and by the rotating procession of stepfathers that the marital cycles of working leading ladies typically produced. The casualties were considerable. Christina Crawford published Mommy Dearest in 1978, the document that became the central public statement of studio-era daughter testimony. B.D. Hyman, Bette Davis's daughter, published My Mother's Keeper in 1985. Christopher Crawford, Christina's brother, published his own corroborating account. The cohort included Liza Minnelli, Lorna Luft and Joey Luft, the 3 children of Judy Garland, whose adult biographies have demonstrated the various trajectories that the structural inheritance of celebrity mother adolescence routinely produced. Cheryl Crane belongs to this cohort. Her 1988 memoir occupies, in the literary record, the same structural position that Christina Crawford's 1978 book and B.D. Hyman's 1985 book occupy. Of the cohort, Cheryl is, in one specific sense, the most consequential. She is the one who, at the age of 14, was required by the immediate physical conditions of the household to demonstrate decisive protective action. The other daughters in the cohort were not asked to perform comparable interventions. They absorbed their respective childhood damages and reproduced them, across their adult biographies, in the various forms that adult survivors of comparable households typically reproduce them. Cheryl was asked to do more. She did it. The doing of it organized the next 6 decades of her life. The medical context for Cheryl Crane's adult biography deserves an honest acknowledgement. She had absorbed across the first 14 years of her life a cluster of developmental traumas that any contemporary clinical evaluation of childhood adversity would identify as among the most severe combinations the available literature documents. She had absorbed the parental marital instability of 7 divorces. She had absorbed the sustained sexual abuse by a stepfather. She had absorbed the witnessed domestic violence of the Stompanato relationship. She had absorbed the immediate physical act of killing a man at 14 years old. She had absorbed the subsequent public visibility, the press intrusion, the hate mail, the institutionalization, and the prolonged separation from her primary surviving parent. The adverse childhood experiences scale. The standard clinical instrument the medical profession has developed over the past 3 decades for measuring the cumulative impact of childhood trauma would, applied to Cheryl Crane's documented adolescence, return one of the highest scores the instrument is capable of producing. The clinical literature on such scores predicts, with substantial statistical reliability, the adult outcomes that should have followed. The literature predicts adult substance dependence, the failure to form sustained adult intimate relationships, chronic mental health crises, and substantially reduced life expectancy. Cheryl Crane did not, by the available adult record, develop any of these outcomes in the predicted forms. She did not become a substance addict. She did not fail to form a sustained adult intimate partnership. Her relationship with Joyce Leroy lasted approximately 45 years. She did not, by the available public record, require sustained adult psychiatric intervention beyond the standard mental health maintenance that survivors of comparable childhood trauma routinely conduct. She did not die young. She has reached her 80s as of the writing of this account. She is, in the long statistical arithmetic of childhood adversity outcomes, a substantial outlier. She is the version of recovery that the clinical literature predicts as the uppermost boundary of achievable outcome. What produced the outlier outcome cannot be precisely determined from the available evidence. The Institute of Living treatment may have been part of it. The structural stability of her grandmother Mildred during the critical adolescent years may have been part of it. The long Joyce-Leroy partnership certainly was. The disciplined adult life she constructed across the real estate career was also part of it. The recovery was in any case real. The final truth about Lana Turner and Cheryl Crane is the truth their 2 memoirs, read together, made structurally impossible to ignore. Lana had been beautiful. Lana had been famous. Lana had been, by every measurement her studio publicity machinery had imposed on the country, one of the central images of mid-century American femininity. Lana had also been, in the daily structural sense, an inadequate parent. She had married 8 times. She had brought into her household, on at least 2 documented occasions, men who had directly damaged her daughter, Lex Barker through sexual abuse, Johnny Stompanato through abuse through the immediate physical danger of his sustained presence. She had not, across the 18 years of her daughter's minority, constructed the protective household scaffolding that an ordinary parenting effort typically constructs. Cheryl had absorbed all of this. She had also, at 14 years old, intervened with the only available physical instrument the kitchen had made available to her. She had killed a man. She'd been removed from the household. She had spent her late adolescence in psychiatric and reform institutions. She had emerged, at 19, with the materials childhood had given her. She had then, across the subsequent 6 decades, slowly and patiently constructed the adult life that her mother had not been equipped to provide her the foundation for. The construction had not been spectacular. The construction had not been photographed by the magazines that had photographed her mother. The construction had been, in the precise structural sense, the quiet daily labor of an adult survivor who had decided, by the discipline of accumulated decades, that the original damage would not be the central organizing fact of her remaining life. She had succeeded. The killing of April 4, 1958, was not the central fact of her adult life. The killing was a fact she had survived. The remaining 6.5 decades had been the life she had built after surviving it. That was the legacy. We began on the upstairs landing of a Bel Air mansion on the night of April 4, 1958, with a 14-year-old girl holding a carving knife and a mother screaming behind a closing bedroom door. We end 68 years later with the same girl, now 82, living quietly outside Los Angeles. The longest tenured survivor of one of the most photographed mother-daughter relationships of the 20th century. What Lana Turner and Cheryl Crane's lives demand of us is the recognition that the children of the famous are not, finally, defined by what their parents failed to give them. They are defined by what they decide, across their remaining decades, to build with what is left. Cheryl built. Next time on Gilded Fate, we tell the story of another studio-era leading lady. A woman who appeared in more than 80 films across 4 decades, who was nominated for 10 Academy Awards across her career, who adopted 4 children inside one of the most carefully constructed celebrity publicity marriages of the 1940s, and whose eldest adopted daughter, 11 years after the mother's death, published the single most damaging celebrity memoir of the entire 20th century. The mother lived to 73. The book never went out of print. You know the actress. You don't know the daughter. If Lana Turner and Cheryl Crane's stories stayed with you, subscribe to Gilded Fate. These are the daughters' history, filed under their mothers' names. They are worth knowing as themselves.